In 1917, Britain declares the Balfour Declaration. This says there will be a Jewish homeland. The amount of land that was promised to the Jews was actually not just what is labeled Israel here, but also Jordan, which at this time was called Transjordan.
This map here saying Balfour Declaration, but it says here British Mandate 1920 approximate. The Balfour Declaration is 1917. So Ben Shapiro is already wrong. It's just wrong. Got a little L there for Benny Morris and fat L for Ben Jabino. Okay, listen guys, we're gonna do a critique of one line from a Benny Morris book, because we've done our little critiques of other authors. We've noticed bad citations or poor information in the likes of like Pape or Khalidi or just like basically any author. The fact is for every author who writes about Israel-Palestine, like you can find them being fairly wrong about at least a couple of things. And with Benny Morris, I found a pretty good one that's worth talking about. So, you might be familiar with people talking about the concept of Greater Israel. You might have also heard people say things like, Jordan is Palestine, or you might have maybe once or twice seen a map that looks like this. So what does all that mean? Well, there is again with the Irgun. This is like a very old Irgun poster from the 1930s where it says Eretz Israel, and obviously it's both Palestine and what was then Transjordan. Basically their way of saying we won all of it. And maybe more recently, you've heard Greater Israel or this concept get whittled down to Israel is just all this, and Palestine is really just all this, like Jordan is Palestine. So they're saying we should have all this. That's why they call it Judea, Samaria, and then with here they call it Jordan or Palestine, right? Where does that come from? Well, one, it comes from the Israeli right and their desire to take as much land as they can from like the original mandate, but it also comes from a piece of bad history. The opinion that's given is based on a very poor understanding of deals and talks regarding borders, and a pretty bad understanding of the transgression of how these borders were formed. So how do you even start talking about this? I don't even... Okay, let's go with the Ben Shapiro one. Let's hear Ben Shapiro's version of the story and let's say why it's wrong, okay? Because he mentions it at the Balfour Declaration. Okay.
A threat, the Jews need some homeland to call their own. In 1917, Britain declares the Balfour Declaration. This says there will be a Jewish homeland in the area of Israel. The amount of land that was promised to the Jews was actually not just what is labeled Israel here, but also Jordan, which at this time was called Transjordan, which makes some sense in the sense that the Arab states around it were going to be Egypt, it was going to be Saudi Arabia, it was going to be Syria, it was going to be Lebanon. There are a bevy of Arab states that surround this entire region. In 1920,
you notice this map here actually contradicts what he's saying. This map here saying Balfour Declaration, but it says here British Mandate 1920 approximate, and here Zionist Organization Proposal to the Paris Conference 1919. The Balfour Declaration is 1917. So you can see here the proposal by the Zionists in 1919 is this, right? They want a little bit more of the Sinai Peninsula. They want a good large chunk of the east bank of the Jordan River, and they want up to here, which is up to the Litany River. So they want what's part of South Lebanon. Obviously, they don't get that. You end up with this map here instead, and Jordan over here. So how is Balfour promising all of this to the Jews in 1917 when this is the mandate from 1920 and this is the Paris Conference from 1919? Well, the answer is Balfour isn't promising them all of this. This map does not exist. This map, actually, the mandatory Palestine map as we understand it, didn't actually come into place until 1923. This part here, a good chunk of the Negev, was not part of Palestine. It wasn't considered part of Palestine. It was added in due to Zionist advocacy because they wanted the Gulf of Eilat. So, what really happened with these borders? Well, before Balfour, and before the British decided what maps would be decided here for Palestine, the Ottoman map was actually very, very different to what we understand now. I can give you a few examples because the Ottoman map changed a lot. They constantly rearranged areas. I think this one is more or less accurate to just about the beginning of World War I. This one here, the independent Sanjak of Jerusalem, was fairly new. I think it came into place in like the late 1870s. But really what counts as Palestine, as we understand it, was you've got Acre. This, I think, can also be called Nablus, and then Jerusalem. These are like the areas here. And then see this part here? This is part of a separate area, right? So if you look at other examples of maps, I think there's one here, yeah, which is late Ottoman Palestine, the same kind of map. I think this is more or less drawn up in around 1899, give or take a few years. So at the time of World War I, there are quite a few deals happening. One, in 1916-15, is when the British are making a deal with a few Arab kings in the Ottoman Empire to say that if you lead an uprising against the Ottoman Empire, we're going to give you a whole bunch of Arab land. They mention places like Syria. They mention places to the west of Syria. They mention around like the Hijaz, like the Arabian Peninsula, but they're very vague about Palestine. They mention like they kind of use a loophole to get away from offering Palestine. It's not really mentioned. It's kind of implied with the way that you interpret their west of this area here, these like 4 Syrian towns, but it's basically left open for a loophole. You could argue deliberately, there's a dispute, whatever. Around the same time, about a year later, after making that promise to the Arabs, the British and the French draw up this agreement that they're going to split up the Middle East into 3 particular areas. You got area B and C. A, which they count as what you would call like Syria, more or less, is what they described it as, is this like part here. And B for the British, which they count as, I think they would call it like Mesopotamia. But these are the 2 areas of influence. And at this time, they imagined what is more or less regarded as Palestine to be an international zone. And that's the border there. But when World War I ends, and you have what seems to be 2 contradictory promises to the Arabs and between the British and the French, well, that has to get resolved somehow based on these 2 agreements. And they do say that there's a bit of an undermining of the Arab agreement because the Arabs in their negotiations with McMahon in Britain, the McMahon-Hussein correspondence, they promised to raise an army of about 100,000 people to fight the Ottomans. In reality, they actually end up raising barely over 1,000 people. So there's a bit of leeway granted. There's a lot of like very ambiguous promises, a lot of loopholes, a lot of ambiguity around borders with dividing up the Ottoman Empire, which is no longer there. So they have another negotiation around 1919, 1920 with the League of Nations. And because we're entering a brave new world of self-determination and post-colonial thought and things like that, you've basically got the British and the French pushing for their imperial interests. And you've got people like Woodrow Wilson bringing their modern, liberal, trans, gay ideas of self-determination. And ultimately, you have this compromise, which is called the mandate system, which is when we give France and Britain administrative control over these parts of these areas in exchange for the idea that they will ultimately be temporarily occupying them until they basically help these new nations form on their feet and then hand it back to them. That's like the idea. The mandate is supposed to be temporary. It's supposed to be there to sort of solidify your connections to the area and solidify trade routes and all that, but ultimately to prepare them for self-governance. Once you reach 1920, though, this is where you get the ambiguity, because what people refer to here when Ben Shapiro talks about this map is they're referring to an agreement in 1920, which takes place at the San Remo conference, which is when they grant the initial mandates. So at San Remo, they grant to the British Palestine and Mesopotamia, which means Iraq. And to the French, they grant a mandate over Syria, which at that time includes Syria and Lebanon. Now, some people argue that Palestine at that time included Transjordan, because I guess you imply it from Area A or Area B. Well, it looks like this British mandate part would include Jordan, right? Now, there's a problem, though, is that this map, which is often seen as the San Remo Conference for the Jewish National Home, this map doesn't exist in 1920. It did not exist. You know it didn't exist because the Negev's not there. The Negev this was not granted to the area of mandatory Palestine until 1923. This map doesn't exist. And at Remo, they explicitly actually said, San Remo, there was no map. They literally say, without mentioning Transjordan once, and again, there's like a whole sort of 12-page document for the minutes that you can look at as well from San Remo, somewhere there anyway. They actually say the boundaries of said states will be determined and the selection of the mandatories made by the principal allied powers. They explicitly move the question of borders on to a different date. And even all that said, you can read the Balfour Declaration. Contrary to what Ben Shapiro says, the Balfour Declaration does not say anything about all of the territory of Palestine. Even if you exclude Jordan, it doesn't say that. It just says a Jewish national home. It's very short. Much pleasure in conveying to you, on behalf of His Majesty's government, the following declaration of sympathy with Jewish Zionist aspirations, which has been submitted to and approved by the Cabinet. His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment of Palestine, of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object. It being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by the Jews in any other country. So again, in Palestine. There's never been any commitment to the idea of all of Palestine. It was going to be in Palestine, and it was going to be in a Palestine in 1917 that was understood to be more or less like this. Or maybe if you're extending the borders a bit to the understood Ottoman boundaries, it's more like this, right? And it's only in this. So why people think it includes Jordan? It seems to be it's based on not that much at all, but we'll get to that. Enter Benny Morris. Yeah, let's do it. Let's go, Benny Morris. I don't think, oh yeah, this is also, Ottoman maps are a fucking nightmare. Look at this. This is like an 1899 Ottoman administrative map. They moved regions around a lot, but this is like, you've got Nablus region, you've got the Acre region, you've got the Jerusalem area. But again, there's always a demarcation line across the Jordan River, always. And unfortunately, because of events that happen a bit later, which I'll tell you about in a minute, people assumed that Palestine would include Jordan. The reason for that is that in 1921, 22, 23, eventually what was negotiated was the British Mandate for Palestine. That's what it was called. And the document, the British Mandate for Palestine, includes Palestine and at the borders as we understand it now, mandatory Palestine, and Transjordan, this border here. It includes that. But it's called the Mandate for Palestine. But if you look at the map for when the border is finally decided, you get this. British Mandate for Palestine map. You've got the British Mandate for Palestine, which is the name of the document that grants it from 21 to 23. But you have mandatory Palestine and Transjordan, which means Transjordan is already distinct from Palestine, even though the whole document is called the Mandate for Palestine. But unfortunately, I think it's really just because of this semantic thing, that people have reinvented the sort of trajectory that this happened on to assume that at one point Jordan was part of Palestine and therefore part of the British Mandate for Palestine included Jordan, which means even if you interpret the Balfour Declaration to mean part of Palestine, they would suggest that it should just mean this, all of it, all of here to here, and then Jordan for the Arabs here to like here. That's just not really what happened. But even it seems that of all the people that made this mistake, even Benny Morris mentions it. He says here, we'll go from the earlier paragraph for context. Britain and France rejected the Congress's resolutions, and in April 1920, at the San Remo Conference, the Allied powers formally granted France and Britain mandates, respectively, over Syria, Lebanon, and Palestine and Iraq. The Arabs immediately condemned these decisions as a betrayal of promises of independence, and Faisal's followers embarked on guerrilla raids against the French in Lebanon. Ignoring Faisal's last-minute unconditional surrender, the French took Damascus on July 26th. Faisal was exiled and later was declared king of Iraq, where he ruled under the British tutelage until his death in 1933. France was unhappy with Britain's control of Palestine, which in 1920 included Transjordan, from which pro-Faisal raiders continuously harassed the French in Syria. Now, why does Benny Morris say this? He's a trusted source. Righteous Victims is not really an academic historian book because it's mostly from secondary sources, although he does draw from like pretty reputable sources. I managed to find the footnote that this comes from. If you look down, the footnote doesn't come until way at the end of this paragraph with a quote, footnote 107. So it could be that the footnote here mentions this part as well as all this. So I found the footnote 107, and it links to this author called Bernard Wasserstein from 1991, Kurds on to Balfour, who are a British administrator to Balfour in 1919. Now, I could find this original book, but it costs like £150, and I couldn't find a PDF of it. So that book is off the table, even though it seems to be like this book in particular, this author, is Benny Morris's go-to for the British Mandate period. So now I'm like, how do I find this out? And as it happens, I found the author had written another book called Israelis and Palestinians, Why Can't They Stop? He wrote this book about 10 years later. And because he is the go-to author on this mandate period, sort of 1917 to 1930s, 40s, he actually writes about that period, the 1920s. And he writes specifically about this idea of Greater Israel. So I guess we should just read this and see where the confusion comes from. So, was Palestine partitioned in 1921 to 2? Oh, sorry, this is also the reason people say Palestine was partitioned. This is the argument that's given by the Jewish Virtual Library, is they will argue that there was a decision made in 1921-22 involving Churchill to split Palestine down the middle here, down the Jordan River. The context that this happened in was when King Faisal, who was part of the agreement to fight the Ottomans, tries to take over Syria. He occupies Syria. He says this is ours against the French. And this is also when you have like the first big anti-Zionist revolt in Palestine, 1920, when they chant like Palestine is ours, the Jews are our dogs. And at this time, there's like a riot and like 5 Jewish people die. And the Arab nationalists at this point are expecting Palestine, most of them are expecting it to become part of Greater Syria under Faisal. So they're emboldened by Faisal taking over Syria. But the French get really angry at Faisal. They come in, basically kick him out with their superior army. And this is where you get the problem, is that at this time, the British start asking, wait, the French just marched their troops into here. Now, wait, what happens to Jordan? They literally do that. Like, they literally ask what happens to Jordan. They're like, are the French going to come all the way down here? Because at this point, between 1920 and 21-22, the British are administering this side of the Jordan River. They're not doing that much at all here. They don't have a military presence here. They're not administering the Jordan area because even they don't actually know what's happening with Jordan. They are worried about the French trying to come down here and establish control, and that's why they start talking about what's going to be the future of Jordan. They don't actually know. So it completely betrays the idea that Palestine included Jordan in 1920 because the British administration from 1920 didn't go past the river for the most part. I don't think it might have gone maybe along the bank, but as far as I know, it didn't include Jordan. So there's ambiguity there. So this person here, I think, gives a really good explanation of what actually happened. So he says, also, funny story about Faisal. When he is kicked out of Syria by the French, the British 2 years later or 3 years later needed someone to administer Iraq. So what the British did was they needed a guy. Faisal needed a country to rule, apparently. So they just chose him. They just took the guy who failed at taking over Syria and just put him in Iraq and made him the king. They literally just did imperial musical chairs with this guy. And whilst and just before that's happening, Faisal's brother, Hussein, is starting to eye up Jordan because there's a vacuum here. People don't know what's happening with it. But anyway, here's what happens. Was Palestine partitioned in 1921-22? The text of the Balfour Declaration of 2nd November 1917 refers to Palestine, but nowhere defines its limits. Abdullah, not Hussein. Oh, I'm sorry, Abdullah. I'm stupid. Anyway, yeah, King Abdullah, yeah. Hashemite, yeah. All right. When Britain occupied the country in the course of the following 11 months, she established a military occupation regime for the whole of the Levant under British control and divided it, like Gaul, into 3 parts. Occupied enemy territory, north, the former Sanjak of Beirut, covering much of what is today Lebanon, was placed under French military rule. OETA east, consisting of the former Vilayet of Damascus, corresponding more or less to modern Syria, placed under an Arab administration headed by Emir Faisal, and OETA south, the former Sanjaks of Accra and Nablus, and the independent Sanjak of Jerusalem. Roughly what became British Mandatory Palestine, except for the Negev Desert, was placed right under direct British military rule. See, the Negev is later. Until 1923, when an Anglo-French convention settled the northern borders of Palestine and a conclusive peace treaty was signed with Turkey, the question of the future northern and eastern boundaries of the country and of the Jewish national home remained open. The Egypt-Palestine border, which had been agreed before the First World War. At the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, the Zionists pressed hard for the inclusion in Palestine of the sources of the Jordan River in southern Lebanon. They also urged that the eastern border of the country be set east of the river so as to include a 25-mile wide strip of territory in Transjordan. The most forceful exponent of the Zionist proposal was the future British High Commissioner Herbert Samuel, at that time working closely with the Zionist organization. So again, Ben Shapiro is already wrong. Because how can the Balfour Declaration promise Palestine, which includes Jordan, if in 1919, 2 years after the Balfour Declaration, are the Zionists asking for parts of Jordan to be in Palestine? Why are they doing that, right? It doesn't make any sense. In a letter to the Foreign Office in June 1919, Samuel stressed that for the maintenance of a population in Palestine, numerous enough to support the structure of a modern state, the fertile territory east of Jordan proposed to be included within the boundaries is also essential. The Zionists received some influential support. Balfour, for example, wrote, "In determining the Palestinian frontiers, the main thing to keep in mind is to make a Zionist policy possible by giving the fullest scope to economic development in Palestine. Thus, the northern frontier should give to Palestine a full command of the water power which geographically belongs to Palestine and not to Syria, while the eastern frontier should be so drawn as to give the widest scope to agricultural development on the left bank of the Jordan, consistent with leaving the Hejaz Railway, which ran north-south about 30 miles east of the Jordan, completely in Arab possession." Yet, in spite of this powerful advocacy, no decision on the issue was taken at that stage. In April 1920, when the San Remo Conference assigned the mandate for Palestine to Great Britain, the question of borders was raised in discussions among the members of the Supreme Council, consisting of delegates of the USA, the British Empire, France, Italy, and Japan. The British and French debated the issue acrimoniously. The British Prime Minister, David Lloyd George, referred delegates to the ablest book on Palestine which had ever been written, George Adam Smith's Historical Geography of the Holy Land. In a telegram to the Foreign Office summarizing the conclusions of the conference, the Foreign Secretary, Lord Curzon, stated, "The boundaries will not be defined in peace treaty, but are to be determined at a later date by principal Allied powers." When Samuel set up the civil mandatory government in mid-1920, he was explicitly instructed by Curzon that his jurisdiction did not include Transjordan. Following the French occupation of Damascus in 1920, the French, acting in accordance with their wartime agreements with Britain, refrained from extending their rule south into Transjordan. That autumn, Emir Faisal's brother Abdullah led a band of armed men north from the Hejaz into Transjordan and threatened to attack Syria and vindicate the Hashemites' right to overlordship there. Samuel seized the opportunity to press the case for British control. He succeeded. In March 1921, the Colonial Secretary Winston Churchill visited the Middle East and endorsed an arrangement whereby Transjordan would be added to the Palestine Mandate with Abdullah as its emir under the authority of the High Commissioner, and with the condition that the Jewish national home provisions of the Palestine Mandate would not apply there. Therefore, Palestine was not partitioned in 1921-22. Jordan was not excised, but on the contrary, added to the mandatory area. Zionism was barred from seeking to expand there, but the Balfour Declaration had never previously applied the area to the east of the Jordan. Why is this important? Because the myth of Palestine's first partition has become the part of the concept of Greater Israel and of the ideology of Jabotinsky's revisionist Zionist movement. Long after the establishment of Israel, the revisionist political heirs, the Herut Party, the core element in what became the Likud, led by Menachem Begin, still dreamed of a Jewish state that would include Transjordan. Their phrase was, "The Jordan has two banks. One is ours, and the other too." Most revisionists conveniently forgot that their ideological hero, Jabotinsky, as a member of the Zionist executive, endorsed the arrangements in 1922 that explicitly prohibited Jewish settlement in Transjordan. More recently, advocates of Israeli annexation of the West Bank have asserted that the proper home of the Palestinian Arabs are in Transjordan. Hence the slogan, "Jordan is Palestine." That's why when you talk to fairly right-wing Zionists about compromise, some of them actually believe that the compromise is this becomes Israel and this becomes Jordan, because they say that they're giving up half of what was promised to them by the British. It's just wrong. And even like the Jewish Virtual Library, which I don't think is a horrible source, like they do have information on there that I think is correct, but this, when you look San Remo Conference map 1920, the first thing you get is the Jewish Virtual Library with this map, and it's just wrong. It's just a fake map. This map never existed in 1920. It was never drawn. And also L for Benny Morris. I don't even think his footnote mentions this, because the author, who is footnoted first after this quote, disagrees with it clearly. Unless he changed his mind, but he doesn't seem to have. And I guess what happens here is that first of all, it's not unusual for a historian to not footnote everything, because some things are just truisms. Like, I don't think you need to footnote the idea that Hitler was the leader of the Nazi Party in 1938, right? Like, yeah, you don't need to do that. But yeah, I guess this was just a truism that Benny Morris believed, I guess. So yeah, back in 2001 or whenever he finished this book. So yeah, got a little L there for Benny Morris, and fat L for Ben Jabino. I feel like Ben's is worse because he literally shows a picture of a map that contradicts what he's saying. But anyway, there we go. That is the history of the concept of Greater Israel and whether or not Palestine is Jordan. Well done, guys. Now, let's spend the next 2 weeks fighting with leftists who were impressed by that video. I'm sorry. Okay. That's a joke. To be honest, for anything other than Israeli archives and the Nakba, I don't believe Morris to be any better than other mainstream historians. I don't know enough to say. Like, he doesn't seem to know that much at all about anything post-2000. He doesn't, like, Great March of Return, when Finkelstein brought that up, Benny Morris was just like, I don't know. Like, maybe I don't think the IDF were, they might have been immoral, but if what you're saying is true, it seems like they definitely, yeah, he just doesn't seem to know, yeah. Same with, like, Cast Lead or Protective Edge and shit, yeah. But I guess he doesn't really care about all that. Like, he cares about, his newest book is going to be about the 48 massacres, like all of them, so... Destiny said he's a 20th century guy. Yeah, but apparently he might also be more just like a 48 guy. Unless that's just like I don't know. I haven't seen him make that many more mistakes. Like, that's probably the biggest mistake I've seen him make. Because it's actually that mistake about San Remo including fucking Jordan. That's probably the biggest and most consequential mistake I've seen him make, because it serves the like very right wing Zionist idea that still predominates, right? But anyway, I'm just sorry, hang on. I need to say it now. Fuck me. How do I deal with this kind of discourse? Do I just ignore it? I feel like I should just ignore it. It's so unserious. Like, these are absurd people. They don't realize how ridiculous they sound. Obviously, the obligatory tagging. Attacking the border fence doesn't make a 15-year-old a militant, and therefore fair game to be killed under IHL. ISF soldiers shot 15-year-old Ahmed al-Sher in the back of his head with live ammunition. He was throwing tires at this time. The commission did not pose an immediate threat of death or serious injury when he was shot. They tell you this, that he was 15, that he got shot. What they don't tell you, and what they don't tell you for quite a few of these biographies, is that he was a militant who was attacking the border fence. I like it, however, clip this conveniently misses out that it's not just attacking the fence. Does being part of a military wing not make you a militant? Like, what the who am I? Like, they could see the picture. They know what I'm talking about. Claimed from Al-Quds brigades. It's not like they could have checked my notes. They're public. Like, what the So apparently you can be part of a military wing. You can be attacking the fence with the army on the other side, but you're still not a militant. Does this mean that, and the reason I bring this up now is because, like, does this mean that, I guess, when Hamas, like, were they just not militants until they actually landed in the kibbutzim and started shooting? Before that, they weren't militants. When they break down the fence, when they were charging motorcycles in, were they not militants at that point? It's so fucking dense. And now I've got, like, fucking people saying I'm just, like, trying to justify fucking child murder. So he was just throwing a rock, like, deranged, justifying killing children. Like, fuck me. I'm glad you think you have to be 18 to be a militant, but sadly PIJ doesn't. Hamas doesn't. Oh god, but it's like, what's the fucking point? What's the point? So apparently they could have just conscripted, if they just managed to conscript enough under 18s to break the border fence before October 7th, they would have all been fine. They'd have all been off limits, apparently. Like, do I bother, or is it just giving attention to someone who is clearly like missing a few screws? I don't know. He's never gonna listen. Yeah, but I feel like spectators might listen. I don't know, because I feel like someone watching that on their phone might just not know why I said the guy was a militant. It's so dumb. Whoever clipped that knew what they were doing as well, because I show the website where PIJ claims him, but they just didn't show that in the clip. Oh god, how can people be like this? It's so fucking annoying. Like, ooh. Anyway, post the fucking official death notice. Okay. I presume you won't dignify that with a response. Oh, I'll dignify all kinds of bullshit. You think I'm above dignifying insane statements with a response? Never happen. I see we have a dispute in the chat. No one knows the best way to respond to this. God.